I am Andrew Holden, and I'm the A&R educator in Ashtabula County. And for this presentation, I'm going to be joined by Tom DeHaas in Lake County and Les Ober in Geauga County. So we are all three Northeast Ohio extension educators. And we're going to be talking about introduction to basic soil science and soil testing. Three main areas we are going to try and cover today are taking a soil test, talk about the basics of taking a soil test, and we're going to talk about soil health in vineyards, and then we're going to talk about what is your soil test telling you. So I'm going to take on the first part, and then I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues to handle the second and third part. All right. All right, so taking a soil test. Just out of curiosity, go ahead and put in the chat box if you've ever taken a soil test. You can say, yes, I have. No, I haven't. I'd like to, but I haven't gotten the chance to. I want to see if people have taken a soil test before. All right, we're getting a lot of yeses. Some no, but I'd like to. Yes, several. Awesome. Some people have, some people haven't. Great. Awesome. It's really nice to see everybody using the chat bots. It lets us know that there's someone out there that we're speaking to. Awesome. Yes, but not on my grape land. Awesome. Just pH. Okay, great. So this first part, if a lot of you have taken soil tests already, shouldn't be too too difficult for you. You're probably already experienced with doing most of this, but I will go over some of the reasons why we need to take a soil test, and maybe if you're not soil testing often, maybe either increase your use of soil testing or give you a reason to improve your soil testing so you can get better results. So first off, I like to show this graph. This is from the Midwest Grape Production Guide, and it shows you the desired ranges for grapes, your pH from 5 to 6.5 or 5.5 to 6.5. And I put in there some varieties can tolerate higher acidity in soils. So depending on what you're planting, you may want to look at specific pH requirements. Later in the presentation lesson, I think Tom even will talk a little bit about the importance of all these levels, but the main thing I want to draw your attention to is there's really no way to know this information without doing some sort of test, whether it's a pH test or a soil test. But a soil test will give you all of this information. And especially when you're creating a new vineyard or redeveloping a vineyard, it's important to have this information because that's the time when you can make adjustments. If your pH is really far off, if your organic matter is off, if your major key nutrients are way off, it's a lot easier to spread fertilizer, spread lime, add organic matter before you are planting. Not to say it can't be amended, but if you want to make those big changes, you got to do that, or it's a lot easier to do that before you're planting. So other reasons to take a soil test, it's cheap and easy to do. $14 is a soil test kit here at the Ashtabula County office. You can get them at your local extension office, pretty much in every county in the state, or you can get it from a local co-op or feed and grain store. So feed or grain mill, excuse me. Taking a soil test is also the only way to know what nutrients are available and what your soil pH is. Like I said, you can't go out there and feel it. You can go out there and look at your soil and say, all right, this is sandy. All right, this soil has a lot of clay in it, but you will not be able to tell just by looking at it what your pH is and what your minerals are and what your nutrients are, excuse me. We recommend soil testing in the fall or spring. So this time of year is a great time of year, especially if you want to change your pH, because it does take a little while to get that pH changed by adding lime. So we recommend, at least in agronomic production, adding lime in the fall so that by springtime when you're doing your planting, that pH has had a chance to change and the lime has been able to react with the soil. I mentioned already, but it is important to do a test when creating a new vineyard, because you don't know what's out there. If if you're clearing land, or if you're using an old field that was maybe in some sort of other type of production, you don't know what the nutrient values are there. It could be highly depleted, especially if it was a hay field or a crop field that fertilizer hasn't been applied to in years. It's also a tool that you can use, soil test, that is a tool that you can use if you are seeing nutrient deficiencies or other issues in your grapes that maybe can't be attributed to other things. So if you have a specific issue that you're looking for, soil testing might be a tool in that toolkit to try and figure out the cause of that issue. Obviously, we can do plant sampling as well for nutrient deficiencies, but soil testing is another tool, like I said. So quick and dirty on how to take a soil test. If you get one from the extension office, it'll come in a bag, and inside that bag, you will have your soil sample bag right there on the left, and then you'll have a form. You'll have to fill out that form, and then you'll have to fill your sample bag with a soil sample, and you put that all inside the bag that it comes in, and you can mail that to the laboratory. When taking a sample, we recommend using a soil probe, but you can also use a shovel or a spade, and you'll also need a clean bucket. So some of the tools involved. A lot of extension offices have probes available. Not everybody has probes on their farm. Some people invest in getting one if they're doing a lot of soil testing. But if you don't have one, we have them available to borrow at most extension offices. The idea of the probe is it gets a nice even profile all the way down, in that core. And with a shovel, you can use it, but you just want to make sure to try and get an even profile from top to bottom all the way down to your depth that you're testing to, just to make sure that you have uniformity across all your subsamples. And then the other tool that you're going to need is a clean bucket. You can see that blue bucket up there. Making sure you have a nice clean bucket that doesn't have any residue of anything else in there that can affect the soil sample is very important. Let's see. All right. So when you actually collect your sample, we recommend going in an X or a Z pattern. Before you have any grapes planted, or before you have any infrastructure put up, it's a lot easier to go through and kind of go in a zigzag pattern. Avoid sampling just on the edges or just in the middle. You want to have a fair representation of the entire field. For grapes, we recommend sampling at a depth of 8 inches. What I like to do is take my soil probe and either take a permanent marker or take a piece of electrical tape and mark 8 inches. So I'm going down and hitting that 8-inch depth mark every time. We recommend taking 15 to 20 samples per test. And we recommend taking one test per 5-acre vineyard, all the way up to 10 acres. 10 acres would probably be your max for your vineyard size, as long as it's uniform. So if you have a field that has a nice slope to it, and then half of it is a flat land at the bottom of that slope, you may want to test those separately, because more than likely those soils are different, and the nutrient values are going to be different there. So when you look at doing your samples, don't look at it just from a strictly vineyard A versus vineyard B, but look at it as, all right, this area is the same, this area is the same. You might have to separate it by, type of grape. So, if certain grapes require different requirements, you may want to separate it that way. And then obviously, like soil condition, if you have an area like we have this graphic up here on the presentation, and it's showing three possible sample locations. So the first one is where all the numbers are. The next one is up to the left. It has a eroded spot there. So they're staying away from that eroded spot because they know that would compromise the rest of the soil test. And then down here at the bottom right, it says sample 3 low spot. So there's a low spot there, and they know that would be different as well. So they're staying away from that. like I said, if you have a problem area, you can aim that soil test specifically to that problem area to see if there is underlying cause of that. But really, you're wanting to take a soil test of an area that is uniform, and between 5 and 10 acres is really the maximum size you want to test in your vineyard. All righty. And just to go back, I said avoid sampling just the edges or just the middle. You really want to get a good representation of that whole area. So not just in row. You want to not be getting a lot outside, basically anywhere that grapes will be. So, if the roots will be pulling nutrients from that area, that's where you want to be sampling. All righty. So moving right along, once you get your sample, you can once you get your 15 to 20 samples, you put it in your clean bucket, mix all those together. And once mixed thoroughly, you can take 1 cup, depending on your soil test, you might need more than that. But as you can see by that picture, ours requires 1 cup approximately of soil, and you can put in that bag. We don't want you to put that in the oven or microwave or dry it out any way. It'll get dried out at the testing facility. If you decide to dry it yourself unnaturally, then that can cause issues with your results. So put it in the bag, fill out your form, like I already mentioned, and then mail your entire kit to the testing lab. Then all that's left is you have to wait for your results. So it shouldn't be very long waiting for your results. Usually we expect a week to 10 days. And if you get it at the extension office, if you get your soil test at the extension office, we get a copy as well. So you can take a look, and we can take a look at the same time, and we can, if you have any questions, you can give us a call and we can discuss it. So I probably went a little long on this section, but we're going to move right along to our next one. Like I said, if you have any questions, go ahead, put them in the Q&A box. We'll try and get them answered once our presentation's done. But I'm going to hand it over to Tom DeHaas in Lake County, and he's going to get started on soil health.
Can you hear me, Andy?
Yes.
Okay. So Andrew's going to advance the slides. He kind of has control over all this. So my name is Tom DeHaas, and I'm an educator for Lake County, and I work with a lot of mostly nurseries and some of the other growers, but some with grapes too. So next slide. So the first thing and Andy talked about it a little bit, Alice, I hope is going to cover it pretty extensively, but the idea, what do you do with bare ground? So the first thing is looking at cover crops. This was actually a sweet corn field, but again, they have ryegrass to cover that up. You don't want wind erosion in the wintertime. You want to preserve your soil as much as you possibly can. Next slide. So there are a lot of different cover crops that you can use. Radishes have become very common because they have a very deep taproot, and they can kind of get down into the hard pan of the soil and break that up a little bit. And you'll notice in this particular slide that in the foreground, you have the radishes that are growing there, but you also have the grapes in the background. So, again, that kind of preserving the soil, you don't want bare ground. Next slide. This is a combination radishes and clover. So the radishes break up the hard pan, and the clover helps to build soil. I think they're advancing on their own there, Andrew, but maybe not. You actually see the two. You actually see that radish, a pretty good developed root, and it broke off when I pulled it out. But then you have the clover right next to it. So a really good combination of 2 cover crops that you can use to help to build that soil. Other crops that they use in the nursery, Sudan grass, they use sunflower, but this is a good combination if you're trying to build open ground before planting. Next slide. So if you have not put your grapes in, site selection is really important, but Andrew hit it right on the head. There's no way to know what the soil is like unless you test it. So pretty much your site selection is going to be based on, a lot of time it's going to be based on topography. So I know in the Grand River Valley region, most of the more mature grape growers, we don't call them old timers, but they will say that if you see the lake, from your vines, or if there's a line of sight that there's less chance of frost damage. Next slide. So a lot of times you'll see vineyards kind of up on the high ground, and then as that cold air washes, it kind of flows downhill and many times north, and helps to keep the vines on the top of the hill. So site selection from the standpoint of vines is really important, but also soil selection. Next slide. And again, the wind fans will help, but again, if your grapes are in a low spot, that's not really going to help you to basically add airflow to that, because that's where the frost is going to settle. Next slide. So actually, this is a vineyard. I actually took samples from 2 different vineyards. So this is one particular vineyard. And these vineyards are actually less than, as the crow flies, 3 miles apart. Next slide. So this was actually one of the vineyards that we took a soil sample from. And the other vineyard that was in a couple of previous slides is literally 2 miles away. Next slide. So when I actually took the soil sample, so this is Vineyard A and Vineyard B, I physically took a soil sample, and they looked identical. Next slide. So if you look on a sideways view on this, the one on the far left side, they look identical. That one had a little more moisture in it, but they look identical. And one of the ways that what you can do with soil sampling, you can do a physical soil sample where you actually take it and you shake the sample and you determine how much sand, salt, and clay is in there, which will give you a little bit of indication on structure. And Les is going to talk a little bit about the importance of clay in your mix. But really, next slide. When we look at the soil sample for Vineyard A, which was on your slides on the right-hand side, we see a pH of 7.4. Now, when I first saw this, I was kind of, wow, that's kind of alarmingly high, because typically our pHs in Lake and Ashtabula, Lake County, are going to be in that kind of a, 5.5 to 6.5, that kind of a range. And Andrew's, somebody said they lost sound. So the thing that I would say is that you really can't tell by just looking at the soil. The phosphate is a little low, but potash is good, magnesium is good, calcium is good. So next slide. Can you hear me, Andrew? Next slide. Andrew?
It should be on the net side, though.
Oh, okay, Vineyard B. Sorry, my bad. Didn't see it advance. But look at the soil pH here. So literally 2 miles away from each other, and the pH drops almost, 1.1 points. And again, phosphate is low, potash is good, magnesium is good, calcium is good. The question is, how do we know what the pH is going to be? And pH, as Les is going to talk about, is hugely important in nutrient availability for the vine. So if you don't know your pH, you're just guessing. So the next slide. And that's exactly it. Don't guess soil test. The cost of soil testing is so minimal compared to what you're going to do as far as inputs, that it's just I can't imagine why it's not worth spending the $14 and spend that for 4 or 5 different soil tests and getting back actual true results. You probably make it up in one application of fertilizer in knowing exactly what you want to put down. So that so site selection and soil testing, I just encourage you to do that. That for those of you that do it, the value of that. For those of you that haven't done it or are on the fence of doing it, please go ahead and do that. And we will be glad to help you with any interpretation of those results in any of the extension offices. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Les.
All right, Les, are you able to unmute?
Do that.
There you
All
go.
right. Any feedback, Andrew? We were having a little trouble before.
It's a lot better now.
Yeah,
Okay.
That sounds great.
All right. Very good. Thank you. My name is Les Ober, extension educator from Geauga County, also a certified crop advisor, and primarily do work in agronomic work, but I also do some horticulture. Go ahead. Next slide. Okay, pass that one up because in the essence of time, we're not going to spend time on that. Go to the next slide. Okay, this is what we're looking at. When we get a soil test back, this is basically what we're looking at: pH, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. These are the things that are really important with grapes. You can see the values in red. Those are the ones that Andrew gave you. You're also going to see cation exchange capacity and base saturation. And so another thing to notice is that these are in pounds per acre, and sometimes you will get soil tests back that are in parts per million, ppm. Simple conversion. If it's ppm times 2 gives you pounds per acre. If it's pounds per acre and you want ppm, divide it by 2 and you'll get the ppm regulation. Okay. We're also looking at base saturation. Cation exchange tells us a little bit. Okay. Cation exchange tells us a little bit about the soil. When you have a high CEC, typically you have a lot more clay particles. You have a lot more clay particles in the soil. It's a denser soil, a little heavier soil. When you got a low pH, low CEC, excuse me, it will probably have more sand content and be less dense. The other thing is when we work with cation exchange, what we want to do is we want to know that we want to transfer one form of cation to another form. In other words, basically particles are made up of negative charges. And when we have negative charges, a lot of times in a low pH situation, we'll end up with CECs that are down. You'll end up with a low saturation, high levels of hydrogen on those particles. As we add lime, calcium carbonate, we begin to increase the CEC on that. We start to see the saturation go the other way. We have base particles of calcium, magnesium, and potassium begin to take over the sites. Let's move on to the next slide. You'll see this in greater. This was the. I will look at this. We'll look at this at the end of the program. Move on to the next one. Okay. So in a normal pH situation, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to get a neutral as we can. That's 7.0. When we go down to 5, we're down on the acid side. When we're up to 7 or 8, we're on the basic side. Most agricultural soils are going to run between 5.5 and just a little over 8. Okay, the next slide, please. When we have soil pH, we have neutral. Here's an example of some plants you might be familiar with that grow at different. This is a big issue because some plants grow real well. You couldn't have on that soil of 7, 4, and 4. You couldn't grow blueberries on there. You could grow tomatoes. A lot of, for example, white pine would not grow very well on there. So specific cultivars, in the case of grapes, like to grow at different pHs. This is something to keep in mind. Next slide. Here's an example of what happens when we get out of balance in our soil. We go to the acid side, we got a 5.0, and we get down towards 5, you can see that we no longer have the availability of nitrogen that we would have. We get down to phosphorus, we lose the ability to get the availability of phosphorus. Potassium's not as critical, but we're starting to lose availability. We're also gaining things that we may not want, for example, like iron or aluminum that can cause toxicity to the plant. And the same is true when you go the other way and you start getting too basic. Next slide. Here's the example of that clay particle that I was talking about. Every one of those clay particles has negative sites all the way around. On a soil that's tight with about we had a 17.8 on one of those tests. I think it was on the A test. That is loaded with sites. And in an acid soil, all those sites take on hydrogen, and it becomes very hard to move that away. And then you go to the other extreme, where if you had a sand particle, and if a lot of grapes are growing on soils that are high in sand, and in fact, they're either on alluvial deposits or they may be next to Lake Erie or someplace like that, that is an area where where you may have a lot of sand. So you can see that we either have to be a little bit with a soil test, know where we're at, because if we get to the point where we have sand and we don't have a lot of these sites, that calcium we use to take out those hydrogen particles is going to disappear on us real fast. On the other hand, if it's high clay, it's going to take a long time to remove hydrogen and replace it with calcium. Next slide, please. Here's the final slide, and this is the take home on this. This is the slides that Tom showed you. Here's my concern, and you can see this, and I've also put in, you can see here where if we get too acid, we're going to start, or too basic, we're going to start seeing a decline in some of the micronutrients that we may need. So when we go on to go to the next slide, Andy, if you would, please, Andrew. Here's my comparison. Vineyard B is typical soil test. pH is at the desired level. CEC is at 11.5. There is a deficiency in phosphorus, and that needs to be corrected. But the percent base saturation is adequate. In other words, you're going to see calcium levels, which you need for grapes, up around above 65 and pushing towards 80. In other words, that level is, that base saturation is for calcium is high. The ratio we want is probably about 65-15 to 5 in calcium, potassium, magnesium and potassium. Vineyard A, the pH is very high for this area. At this level, it will start to limit the nutrients that you have available. It is significantly above the desired level for some cultivars that may only want to have maybe a pH of 6.0. The CEC is 17.8. What does that tell us? We don't want to put any more lime on here. The more lime we put on, the more pH will the pH will go up. It'll only cause an increase, and it's going to take quite a while for it to come down. If we get into a situation where we do not have enough calcium, we start losing calcium, but the pH is still high, then we might want to take a look at running it on a battery on here. We might want to take a look at putting in something like gypsum or something like that. There's other amendments that we can use. But anyway, high pH is not always the desire. We try to keep it between 6 and 7. I think you're okay. I'm going to let it go at that because we're running late on time. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tom, thanks, Les. And thank you, Tom, as well. So that concludes the first presentation
Okay, so my name's Fritz Westover. I'm a viticulturist. I've worked for about 20 years as a viticulturist. My start is actually closer to you in Ohio. I started at Penn State University. I'm actually a native to Pennsylvania. I grew up in the Poconos. And after I finished my undergrad in horticulture and master's in plant pathology, working with grapes, I worked with Tony Wolf over in Virginia Tech. That's where I met Alice Weiss, who's here on the panel today too. Hi, Alice. I worked there for 2 years as an extension research viticulturist before I moved to Texas and worked for Texas A&M for 7 years. Had a family move there, worked for 7 years until I realized I wanted to get out and go to the West Coast. I worked in California after I left Texas A&M and worked for a sustainability organization called the Vineyard team, where we promoted educational programs and research for sustainability in vineyards in California. During that time, I started consulting back here in Texas and Georgia and the east of the Rockies regions, and started Westover Vineyard Advising. And for the last 4 years, I've been extending the information that I give to my clients through my online academy, which is Virtual Viticulture Academy. So that's just a little bit about me. If you'd like to get a quick glimpse of where I work, this is just a quick map I made showing the regions where I work, primarily in Texas, where we have anything from acidic soil here in the east part of Texas to very high calcareous soil in the hill country of Texas to very high plains agronomic soil where we grow cotton, peanuts, things like that. I work a little bit in Arizona, and I work quite a bit in the mountains of North Georgia, where we also have acidic to neutral soils. So I work with a wide range of soils, and by no means am I a soil scientist, but I know enough about soils to integrate them into my plant nutrient analysis and fertilization strategies. And I think it's critical. I heard someone say you should take your soil samples about every 3 years, and that's what I recommend as well. Soils don't change dramatically unless you're adding some amendments, but plant tissue data changes seasonally and also throughout the season. So we want to monitor that. And just to give you an idea where I work, we get a lot of variability. So I see all ends of the spectrum, and I know Ohio has a wide range of variability across the state as well. So my philosophy is to only apply what is needed. We never want to, just throw out a NPK fertilizer, right? Because we need nitrogen. We would only put out nitrogen if that's all we need. So apply what is needed when it is needed. So we have to understand when plants are most readily uptaking nutrients and how to get them to the roots. And we want to use the correct formulation. Again, not just grabbing off the shelf a standard multi-purpose fertilizer, because if we apply a standard multi-purpose fertilizer with all of the nutrients year after year, we can end up with imbalances in not only our vine growth, but also our soil base saturation. So it really starts with knowing what your nutrients are that are commonly deficient in your site and your region. I think this is probably going to be covered extensively today, but I have here an organic matter particle that shows an attraction of cations, right? So we have on this cation exchange magnesium, calcium, sodium, hydrogen. There could be aluminum in there. And knowing the base saturation on your soil test can be very helpful, because it can give you an understanding if you have a balance that is desirable for plant uptake. And not only that, when you see a deficiency in your plant tissue, you can look back at something like your base saturation. I can remember Terry Bates at Penn State always saying that if magnesium deficiency was common in your vineyard, he would see a trend for if potassium levels were 4 to 5 times as much as magnesium on the cation exchange, he could almost predict that there would be some sort of magnesium deficiency in the soil. So you can use those numbers to kind of not only predict what you might be seeing in the vineyard, but to predict what you might need in terms of fertilization. But I'm going to fall back on the fact that the plant is going to give you the missing piece of the puzzle, and more people, or every person who grows grapes, should be taking plant tissue data at least 1 time a year, if not twice. And I had to throw a soil photo in here. So I thank Maria Smith for sending this photo of a beautiful soil from the pit she dug recently. And a vineyard shows a lot of silty, probably clay loam and some clay subsoil. So I understand drain tiles are important in your region. I understand almost no one is using irrigation. So I won't be talking about fertigation as a strategy today. I'll be talking about soil applied and foliar applied nutrients. Okay, we all know that as we get to a more acidic soil, we have certain nutrients that are less available. I'm sure this has been covered many times and probably will be mentioned many times today. But what I want to mention here is, things like boron, we see deficiencies in boron even in acidic soils. And sometimes we even see zinc deficiencies, although it's not as common. But what we need to remember is that if we keep applying phosphorus, for example, which is not as much available or highly available at low pH or acidic soils, too much phosphorus can actually bind up zinc and make it less available to plants. So we have to watch these micronutrients over time if we're adding things like phosphorus, nitrogen over time, year after year as a maintenance application. So keep an eye on your micronutrients and know what your soil pH is. I know there's already been discussions about liming. I walked in right here at the end where we talked about that. Liming is a good way to get your soil pH into a more neutral range, or at least take it from 5.5 to 6, which can give you a very good increase in availability of nutrients. So enough about soil pH. What I want to get into now is understanding how nutrients are taken up by roots. This is important to understand, and I think the more growers pay attention to this, the more it's going to make sense to them how their strategy is working for fertilization. So we think about nitrogen. You'll hear me use nitrogen a lot as an example because it is a very commonly applied fertilizer in vineyards, and it's got a really dynamic way of moving in soil. Nitrates can move with what we call the mass flow. They can move through soil with moisture. And when you're getting 30 to 50 inches of rain during a normal year, where you are in Ohio, somewhere in that range, I believe, you're getting a lot of movement of nitrogen. Nitrogen can move from where you apply it on the surface as a nitrate, can move into the soil, and it can move past your root zone. And literally the nitrogen has to come into contact with roots where it can be taken up. Other nutrients are not going to move the same way. So we know that potassium has mobility in soil, but it's much less than nitrogen. So it's going to move slowly through the soil. It's better to incorporate it into the soil. Same thing with phosphorus. These nutrients are taken up by what we call diffusion, which is basically the roots need to grow into unexplored soil that hasn't been hit by a root yet, so to speak, of grape, and contact that nutrient in order to take it in to the vine. So you can dump a bunch of phosphorus onto the surface of your vineyard soil, but it's not going to readily move down with the rain. It'll eventually get down a little ways over time, or you can shank it in. There's different methods you could use, even shanking a liquid phosphorus into the soil. But the overall rule of thumb is if you're not getting it into the soil, it's going to sit there for a while, and you can't expect an immediate result from a soil application because it's simply not as mobile and roots need to grow into it and find it. And this is a good case for doing soil sampling, not only in your top soil horizon, your A horizon, but also your lower B horizon. So you can see what the sum of cations are there as well, because you want to know if as vines grow, they're going to be able to tap into some of those nutrients that may not be in the soil surface. I've seen examples where young vines in their first year can show severe potassium deficiency because the roots just aren't growing into the soil to hit it through diffusion, and they haven't gotten into the deeper soil where some of that potassium may be living. So that's usually a transient deficiency, and it's something that will pass over time. So you might want to avoid a knee-jerk reaction to apply large quantities of something like potassium early on if you see deficiencies, if it's not normal in older vines in your region. So the strategy I recommend to all the growers I work with and to everyone in general is to do a combination of soil analysis every roughly 3 years. And we always think of that, or I think of that as kind of your bank account, right? That's the money that you can withdraw from the ATM, right? It's all sitting in the bank account. If you don't have enough 5s, 10s, 1s, and 20s in your denomination, maybe you need to add those. Think of those as the potassium, magnesium, nitrogen, maybe phosphorus, right? Some of your most commonly deficient nutrients. Maybe it could be boron in your case. The petiole or leaf analysis, and I do both, and I'd be happy to discuss that, but I do primarily whole leaf blade analysis for the majority of my vineyards. I tend to add petiole samples when we want to tease out information because we're seeing either inconsistent results or deficiencies that we want to resolve or confirm. So the petiole is an active straw for nutrients. It's a highway where nutrients move around. The results you get from a petiole sample can differ if you take the samples early in the day or later in the hot afternoon. So you should always take them at the same time. I like leaf blades because they're a little more stable. They are a storage organ. I'm not saying that petiole are not useful. They are, just be consistent with how you take them. I like to use leaf and petiole both. What the plant data is going to tell you is what your plants are actually withdrawing from the ATM, which is the soil, right? So are they getting enough of their phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen? You can see that in the plant results. And then you also have to be aware that there's conditions in the vineyard that can affect the plant's ability to uptake certain nutrients. You've all probably heard of spring fever, where it's a cool, wet spring and nutrient uptake is not very efficient because we have low sunlight. Things like potassium deficiency become more of an issue. Drought seasons, that can be an issue, or drought periods, especially early in the season when we have high demand for nutrients, because if you don't have water movement in the soil and you're not irrigated, you don't have a way for that nitrogen and those mobile nutrients to move around and come into contact with roots in the mass flow. So the plant tissue data may not only tell you that you're deficient in the soil, it may also be telling you that there's conditions in the environment, which could be cloudy, rainy weather, or I'm sorry, droughty weather, or in some cases, excessive rain, which could inhibit nutrient uptake as well. So keep that in mind when you're doing your plant tissue analysis. You might even want to take some seasonal notes about how the weather was, rainfall patterns, so you could really compare year to year. Okay, so what resources do I recommend for leaf blade? If leaf blade is new to you and you'd like to try it, you could use the Pacific Northwestern Guide for Nutrient Assessment. This is for irrigated vineyards, but it also is useful, I think, for non-irrigated vineyards because it gives you a baseline for comparison on where your nutrient level should be at bloom and veraison. And what I like about this is they also add a section for juice grapes, which is a little bit different for veraison in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus. So if you're growing juice grapes or Concord, they also grow Concord in Washington, so they're interested in those numbers as well. So these numbers are published and available and can give you a good baseline start if you'd like to look at leaf blade analysis. As far as petioles go, probably the most useful guide is in the Wine Grape Production Guide for Eastern North America. That's edited by Tony Wolfe. And I use this, a little bit of modified version of this with my growers that I work with. One of the things that even Tony Wolfe himself has mentioned in conversations is that the nitrogen levels at bloom may not need to be this high necessarily. They can creep down a little lower, especially if your canopy vigor is good and everything's green. So talking down to 0.8 or 0.75 in some vineyards, and specifically for wine grapes. So those are some guidelines you can use. And here's what I want to talk about, the nutrient demand, because if we can understand when nutrients are most needed by plants, we can understand when to apply them. And most of the nutrient demand is from bloom, bud burst to bloom. That's the most rapid time of growth and uptake of nutrients. Most growers don't sample tissue until bloom. So what you're getting is kind of a progress report on how your season's going by taking that bloom tissue sample. And so I think of it as the progress report because you still have chance to improve. So if you're halfway through the semester, so to speak, and your grade's a B, you can still turn it into an A, maybe by the end of the semester. By the season's end, you could also improve things in your vineyard. So I like to say that if you're going to only sample once during the season, you should at least do it late in the season, because late season sampling can tell you what's needed to meet the demands next year on that bud burst through bloom period. So if you take them at bloom, those samples only at bloom, it's still useful data and it can help you to make adjustments for the rest of the season. But if you take them at veraison, that's when the highest demand for nutrients has been basically seen in the vineyard over the course of the whole season. It's more of your report card. And that's going to tell you what you need to do for that pre-bud burst to bud burst application. And that's important because if you're not in an irrigated vineyard, your primary means of putting at least large quantities of nutrients on if needed is going to be a soil application that's going to be either in the winter or before bud burst. So we really want to know late in the season what our plants are telling us about what they're going to need next year at bud burst. So if you can sample one time, sample at veraison. That's what I recommend. I prefer sampling both at bloom and veraison. I want to see the progress report and the final report card. This is just a little bit more representative of the season. It's usually 25 to 50% veraison. If all of your varieties are at different points at 25, 50%, try to find a sentinel variety in your vineyard, maybe one of your early red varieties or a late white variety, and just sample all the varieties then, because it's more practical to send them in all at once. And be consistent, do that every year. So let's talk a little bit about a few nutrients, and nitrogen in this case, and how they're available throughout the season. So this is a slide I borrowed from Marcus Keller, who wrote the book on the science of grapevines. And it talks about nitrogen timing and fertilizer application. So you have in the early season, most of your shoot growth is coming from storage reserves. So that's basically at bud break and even into bloom, you're still drawing off of reserve nutrients that are in your trunks, your cordons, and your roots. And because nitrogen is a mobile nutrient, it's going to be pushed up and into the system early in the season through your positive root pressure. So what we see on the red line is this nitrogen demand. Let's say we have bud burst here in April, May, then we have a high demand for nitrogen all the way into bloom, just a very steep curve. What the blue line shows is the potential for available nitrogen through the soil. So as the soil warms up, as microbes start to become more active, we start to see the cycling of nitrogen from carbon in the soil and organic matter. So there's a release of nitrogen in the soil. And as you can see, the trend is we get an increase in nitrogen over the season, and later in the season it peaks, or it actually declines. It peaks here right around bloom. So that's good. That means this is why some vineyards can go without fertilizing with nitrogen for many years, because if the organic matter is high enough in the soil and nitrogen cycling and availability is good, you can have nitrogen available to meet the demands of your vine leading into bloom. But where we have poor soil moisture availability, where we have many years of nitrogen depletion, your soil may not be able to keep up with this high demand, and that's why we run into deficiencies at times. There's another little spike here for nitrogen demand near veraison, another good reason to sample your tissues near veraison. And of course, the demands will go down as we get close to harvest. By the time you get to veraison, if you try to put nitrogen on the soil in a non-irrigated vineyard, it's probably going to take a while for it to get moved into the soil. You're going to have to hope that it rains, and that's not really efficient or effective. So that's why sometimes foliar nitrogen applications become very handy throughout the season, later in the season, especially if you're seeing tissue reports coming back low in nitrogen. So let's talk more about nitrogen, because it is a good example case study to follow. Release from nitrogen from the soil, there's none of these numbers are set in stone, but if you need a good kind of well-rounded number, these are numbers I've been working with over the years. If you have, let's say, 1% organic matter in your soil, for every 0.5%, you can get approximately 20 units or 20 pounds of available nitrogen over the course of the season. You'll see sometimes there's an ENR, an estimated nitrogen release from your organic matter, and sometimes it's 80 pounds, 100 pounds per acre. And you could use that as a guideline, but you still need to test your plant tissue to see if your vines are effectively taking that nitrogen up. The release from nitrogen from something like compost, a lot of vineyards are curious about adding compost to their vineyard as a multiple source of nutrients and to add organic matter and add microbial bioactivity to the soil. About 30% of that total nitrogen is available. Usually a compost producer will supply you with a report. About 20% of that is available in year 1, and years 2 and 3, maybe another 10%, maybe nothing. And then of course, if you put fertilizers, if you put irrigation water out, there could be nitrogen or other fertilizers going with your irrigation water. Regardless of that, if you water at all, you should really be looking at your water source and where it comes from. Probably not a big thing for non-irrigated vineyards, but it can be significant where groundwater contains nitrogen and boron. Okay, great slide here. It's not too technical if I help break it down for you here. It's from a study in Germany, and I really like this one because it's very helpful to demonstrate to growers why we time fertilizers at certain times of the season based on growth stages or phenology. So down here we have bud burst starting here in the beginning. We go to flowering, veraison, and then maturity here at the end. And these lines here with the different colors are just different fertilizers, or nutrients rather. And this is the major nutrient uptake throughout the season of these different nutrients. This is a study that was done on Riesling in Germany, but it will apply in general to most vines as a rule of thumb. Early in the season, high calcium uptake by plants. That's why we want to have that calcium or that lime application in the fall or in the winter, so we have available calcium to vines early in the season. Once we start to get into flowering, we see a spike in nitrogen, that's in green, and potassium in purple. And if you look at the spike, it's very high, and that shouldn't make you think that you should always apply more nitrogen and potassium than other nutrients, but that's just telling us that the vine needs more of those nutrients. So even when you look at the test results and the recommendations on the standards charts for petiole or leaf, you'll see that, for example, magnesium, which is way down here, you only need about 0.3% in your petiole, and you would need about more like 1% in your nitrogen and 1.5% in your potassium, roughly. So that's why those are higher. But there is a spike in magnesium here. So there is a demand for magnesium after flowering. So applying magnesium, whether it be through dolomitic lime or magnesium sulfate, although you have to be careful with too much sulfur fertilizer, it can actually drive your pH down. So you need to mitigate that with your lime applications. But you can apply magnesium, let's say at bud burst, or potassium or nitrogen, and hope that it gets rained into the soil if you get it in before bud burst. And by the time flowering comes and your demand peaks, you should have availability of those nutrients. Same thing for phosphorus. And then you get another little spike of these nutrients just after veraison when fruit is ripening, especially calcium again. And here is where you would probably be relying on foliar sprays to help with ripening of fruit. I'm not saying all foliar sprays are perfect and that they're taken up into vines very efficiently, but I've seen good results with foliar sprays later in the season where we see deficiencies and where we want to make sure we're ripening especially large crops. So this table is basically showing you that if you get things out ahead of the curve, especially in a non-irrigated vineyard, there's a better chance for it to be available and coming into contact with the roots by the time those plants need those nutrients. Okay, so let's look at a sample report. This one's from A&L. This is an older report, Eastern Laboratories. There's Waypoint Analytical. I know you have your local labs you can use there as well. We get the report back from the lab for a petiole test, and it says that we're low in magnesium. We want 0.35, we have 0.16%. It says we're also low in sulfur. So what kind of fertilizer could we use to meet the demands of the vine for both sulfur and magnesium? In this case, I would choose magnesium sulfate because it's got both of those in it. It's inexpensive, it's highly soluble, and it can be worked into the water or to the rain with water or rainfall. I even apply magnesium sulfate through drip irrigation in irrigated vineyards, and that works quite well. Let's say your report says you're a little low in calcium and also in nitrogen. Well, you could apply an inexpensive nitrogen and add some lime to get your calcium, or you could apply something like calcium nitrate. You'd have to look at the budget of the amount of nitrogen and calcium you're actually getting that's available from those products and come up with, in your case, the least expensive combination, but calcium nitrate would get right to the point of addressing your nitrogen and your calcium deficiency in this case. So this is how you can use your plant tissue test to try to formulate or choose already formulated fertilizers for your vineyard applications. This is a report that I was handed by another member of your group from Ohio. It shows me that, yes, we have some low nitrogen. This is a petiole test, and I believe the variety was Chamberson wine grapes. So Chamberson's known for being a little pale green already, yellowish. We're down below 0.8. This is a late season analysis, so I'd like to see it more like 0.7 to 0.8. It's 0.69. So we're probably going to respond with a nitrogen application maybe immediately after harvest of a highly available nitrogen source. Okay, so like ammonium sulfate or something that would be readily available and dissolving into the soil. You don't want to fertilize too much in the fall, but you can put out small amounts such as 5 to 10 pounds or units per acre with no issue of causing excess vigor in most of my experience. And I'd be open to anyone's experience on that as well. When we talk about other deficiencies in this vineyard, potassium's low. It's at 0.33. Near veraison, we want to be closer to 1%, 1.25%. So we could apply potassium starting now and let that potassium work its way into the soil. When I say starting now, I mean right after harvest. We can do a foliar application if we're at veraison and we need to get some potassium into the system before harvest, but you're just not going to get it into the vines by putting it on the ground. It's not going to move quickly. So this would tell me a foliar application of nitrogen and potassium, maybe a product that contains both of those. You could use, I use a lot of Helena products, so maybe a product like Megafol, which contains both nitrogen and potassium. We'd apply that back to back, a few quarts per acre with our fungicide sprays leading into harvest. And then we'd address this issue going into the spring before bud burst with our applications to the soil. So there's a couple ways you can do it. And you do want to respond when you see low numbers like this, you do want to respond quickly And sometimes foliar is going to be your only option for quick application if you don't have irrigation. Okay, so if you want to effectively build a nutrient budget and really understand and have all the pieces of the puzzle year in, year out, and what I do this for is I do this to look for trends. If we're adding fertilizer and we're not seeing results, or if we're seeing deficiencies and they're only happening every few years, why are they happening? You can build a template that would basically have your crop yield and estimated yield. You would have your nutrient data as what you estimate is removed with the crop, and I'll talk about that next. And then you can take your soil samples about every 3 years and look at those. And then if you do use water, include your water sample report. But don't forget, we want plant tissue results at least once a year. I would say at least at veraison, but hopefully you're going to do them at bloom and veraison. So let's talk about that nutrient removal part of this equation, because this is something that I think is not really thought about often enough. Not enough attention is paid to this. But if you look at how nutrients are removed from the vineyard, think about this. Okay, we've got these grapes. Check it out. They're harvesting, right? We're not dropping them due to disease. Let's pretend we're harvesting them, and you just harvested 5 tons per acre of Chambourcin. Let's just call it Chambourcin, since we're on the Chambourcin kick here. 5 tons per acre is not unheard of Chambourcin. You're going to remove between 2 to 6 pounds of nitrogen per ton of Chambourcin. So if the average is 4 pounds, if we're just going to use averages, that means for 5 tons per acre, you've removed 20 pounds of nitrogen in that acre. Now, if your organic matter is 6% and your estimated nitrogen release is 150 to 200 pounds of available nitrogen per year or something like that's high. But if it was there, you may be able to mine that soil for nitrogen and not add anything to it. The way you would find out if that's working or not is by taking your plant tissue test and making sure you're not running into a deficiency over time. Because basically our plants and our roots are mining minerals out of the soil. So when that crop leaves and goes to the winery, it's taking 4 pounds per ton of nitrogen, about 1/2 pound of phosphorus, 5.5 pounds on average, could be as high as 8 pounds of potassium, a little bit of that calcium that you're putting in there, and a lower amount of magnesium. So for example, how is this data useful? If a vineyard I'm working with has high vigor in the vineyard and magnesium deficiency problems, but they have high potassium, we're not going to add potassium for several years probably unless we see a deficiency in plant tissue. And over time, we're hoping that that's going to deplete the soil of more potassium. It's going to go away out of the vineyard with the fruit. It's going to go into a bottle of wine, and it's going to go to a tasting room into someone's home. That's where your vineyard nutrients end up. They end up on the dinner table. Okay, so think about that next time you're having a glass of wine at Thanksgiving. So we're going to remove the leaves in the fall. They may blow out of the vineyard. Some of them may decompose. We're getting some nutrients from those leaves. If you typically take your canes out and take them to the end of the vineyard row and burn them, you're not returning them to the soil. So I have no idea how much nutrient is removed with those canes, but it must be significant. So this is why there's a lot of gray area. You can't just use these numbers in the yellow column and then fertilize back with exactly those amounts each year based on your harvest, because there's other things happening. It's a very dynamic process, but the more you understand the ratios that nutrients are being removed and the ballpark of it, the better you can interpret your data and understand what's going on. Okay, so I know we're not doing a lot of irrigation in Ohio, but I just wanted to point out that if you are irrigating a vineyard, for those listening today that do, you have potentially potassium, nitrogen, sulfur, boron, salts in your water. And the amount of nitrogen in this particular water test, if you watered an acre foot of water in irrigation per acre per year, you would supply all of the nitrogen needs of that vineyard in 1 year just from your irrigation water. So that's an interesting thing to throw out there. And I think those of you who are not irrigating, you're not going to look at this, but you're definitely going to look at your crop yields year to year, your plant tissue test, and your soil test. Okay, so uptake of fertilizers based on application methods. If you guys have a camera and you want to take a photo of this, you're welcome to. We're going to make the slides available later, but if you want a quick kind of cheat sheet here to have on your phone, I don't mind if you take a photo of my slides. This is just one to help understand application methods and availability to plant. So if you apply most nutrients on the soil surface, as you see, most of the uptake is going to be slow and dependent on rain or incorporation. Nitrogen and potassium are going to move in with rain, so will magnesium, so will boron. Boron is a non-charged elements, so it's going to move pretty quickly. Manganese and zinc a little slower. If you can push nutrients through the drip irrigation, and believe it or not, I've got vineyards I work with in Georgia now that get 30 to 40 inches of rain a year, but we still have irrigation. Number one, because we have Pierce's disease, and there's a product we apply through the irrigation to help mitigate Pierce's disease. But also, we can spend about a third of the cost on fertilizer because irrigation applies it much more efficiently. So you can get nitrogen in very quickly by pushing it in with irrigation, moderately with potassium, fast with magnesium, fast with boron. And then your foliar sprays can be fast for something like nitrogen. I've seen applications of foliar nitrogen and potassium result in a kind of a greening up of the canopy. So we know it's helping to some degree. It's not solving the problem, it's more of a Band-Aid, but when we need something from veraison to harvest to quick fix or help a deficiency in potassium or nitrogen that we see, we can work on it in that direction. Boron's also a good one, and zinc for foliar applications. So products like Orbix from Helena. Again, I'm not affiliated with any company, but Orbix has the nitrogen, potassium, some desert plant extract stuff for stress, and then it has this micronutrient packet in it, which basically has all those micronutrients. So you can find products like that. So if it's a slow uptake or slow available product, applying on the soil, for example, apply well before the peak demand. We showed that slide of the Riesling vines in Germany. You're going to be applying a lot of those nutrients before bud burst so that you can get them into the soil before the demand peaks. If it's a moderate, like if you're dripping it through the drip, or if it's quickly available through the soil, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before peak demand is okay. If you need something quick, that Band-Aid, maybe a foliar application will help you get through until the soil application is available. Okay, speaking of taking photos, that's all I want you to do here. I want you to grab a screen capture, take a photo. This is your cheat sheet. This will tell you how many actual units or pounds per acre of a fertilizer you're applying based on the concentration of that nutrient in the fertilizer. So, if ammonium sulfate contains 21% nitrogen, that means for every 100 pounds of nitrogen you apply per acre, you get 21 pounds or 21 units. That's an exchangeable term by farmers per acre of that nutrient. For liquid fertilizers, if you're applying through foliar or through a drip system, it's a different equation. And then, of course, if you want to know how much nitrogen you're getting in irrigation water, you could use this equation down here. So snip, snap your photo, and we'll make this available for you. As far as compost goes, I've done a lot of work even back when I worked in Penn State with Jim Travis and Terry Bates and a few other folks who are involved in some projects. This is a picture from California of what I think is my favorite and most efficient way to apply compost in the vineyard. If your whole vineyard floor needs nutrients and you're growing maybe a very shallow rooted grape, something like a hybrid or Concord, maybe application as a broadcast is fine, but this banding of the compost every other row can be very efficient. You can use lower rates of compost, such as if normally the recommendation is 6 tons per acre, you can go as low as 2 or 3. And then the next slide shows a customized tool that's disking the compost in, because you want to really keep those nutrients available in your soil. And a lot of the nitrogen can volatilize, as many of you are aware, if it sits on the soil surface. Rates of compost can vary, and it's tricky, but most growers are going to try to limit the amount of nitrogen they apply based on nitrogen, because there tends to be large amounts of nitrogen available. As I mentioned before, about 20 to 30% of total nitrogen from your compost analysis will be available as a slow release nitrogen, which is a benefit. It's not going to give a shock that bolts your shoots really quick, but it's a slow release, and you don't want to overdo it with the nitrogen. So in Virtual Viticulture Academy, which is the academy where I have my group, so to speak, and my community of growers, I have some tools like this calculator here for compost rates. It's based on available nitrogen. You would fill in the boxes with the desired nitrogen availability per acre. If you wanted 30 units, you put that in here. You put in the results from the lab, the percentage nitrogen, the pounds per yard or pounds per ton of compost weight, and then it will tell you, okay, if you have 5 acres, you need 14 tons of compost, or the rate should be 2.9 tons of that specific compost. So don't just apply compost, get it tested. If the lab's not testing it, or if you're producing your own, send your samples to the lab and get a compost analysis done, at least for nitrogen. Okay, so my advice, I want to make sure I leave time for questions. My advice is that before you plant your vineyard, you would add any needed fertilizers or amendments based on your rooting depth, based on your soil test, and you would try to set the ATM with all of the denominations it needs to get the vines growing healthy. After your vineyard is planted, you want to make a plan to be flexible with the season. So you're going to take your plant test. You're going to respond to the plant test, not a knee-jerk reaction, but you have to make sure you're watching the trends in your plants so that you don't have to apply large amounts of fertilizer after a big deficiency is there. Add only the fertilizers that are needed and at only the rates needed based on plant test and visual observation. Don't just throw out broad spectrum fertilizers because it's what's available and it's what's cheap. You want to make sure you're not throwing off the balance of your sum of cations or base saturation, or competing with nutrients by adding too much potassium, which can compete with magnesium, for example. And then fertilize at a time and with a method for best uptake. I tried to cover this briefly, but hopefully it gave you an idea of ground versus foliar versus drip applied fertilizers and how soon you need to apply those relative to that peak in demand. And so if you didn't write this all down, that's okay. We've recorded this talk and we'll make this available. I'm going to also leave you with a few recommended resources. So on my Academy, I do have many free to the public available resources. The target values that I mentioned for nutrients for petioles is on there. That's available. The nutrient values for whole leaves, that's on there. I have some webinars and things that I go into. If you like the style of the presentation today and you want to see more presentations on this topic or different topics, I do have a membership in the Academy where I have some extra stuff available there. I've got lots of free stuff though, like notes on composting your grape pomace, or some videos on, I have a new video now on how to properly sample leaf tissue for analysis, where I cover both petiole and leaf blade sampling, and that's totally free and available to the public. So I invite you guys to go there and check it out. I also have a lot of workshops I do during the year, and I videotape all of these because I feel I have lots of members in different states, several in Ohio, Maryland, Virginia, California, Texas. And so I videotape all these. I've probably got over 8 hours of just pruning instruction alone from 2018 to 21. And you can come and hang out with us live now that we're getting through the pandemic. If you ever want to join one of these workshops, I try to do them in different states and get all the members of the Academy together to do this. It's a lot of fun. So if you're interested in that, we have all the resources here. I'm, of course, a resource to you here today to answer your questions, whether it's field courses, webinars, or my twice monthly live vineyard advising. That's another thing that I do. I hang out right here in my studio, and twice a month I go live and I answer questions from all of the growers in the field. It's super fun because you hear questions from all over the country and see pictures of their vineyards, and sometimes a picture of their cute vineyard dog. So that's nice too. The Academy site is virtualviticultureacademy.com. And all of my contact is right here. If you want to take another picture of this, you can get in touch with me at Fritz at virtualviticultureacademy.com, or just check out the website and grab some free content and let me know what you think. That's the important thing. I want to kind of hear back from you. And if I don't get your question answered today for any reason, such as we run out of time, I want to make sure you can contact me, and I welcome you to send your question to me directly.
I'm going to talk today about undervine management on Long Island, and I am presenting this with the input from my colleague Andy Senesac, who's one of the best weed scientists I've ever met, and I feel very fortunate to have him in my office. So he's had a lot of input into this. So I'm not going to talk so much about soil management, but what goes on the vineyard floor. So Amanda, how am I advancing this?
Is it not going with the arrows?
No.
Oh, that's weird.
Okay, I will
try clicking.
There we go.
Okay.
So we work for Cornell Cooperative Extension in Suffolk County. So we are also extension agents. And we're on the very east end of Long Island, so probably about as opposite as we can get from Ohio. We're sticking way out into the Atlantic. We have, there's a facility, a Cornell University facility called Long Island Horticultural Research and Extension Center. And so that's a multi-commodity, multi-discipline facility, both university and extension personnel. And you can see our farm is kind of L-shaped, and that's the vineyard there in the red circle. So I manage about 2 acres there. And I've been doing that for a long time, 26 years. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk, about what we see and what our thoughts are on Long Island. You're, obviously going to have to mull this over and translate it for your area. So I'm not here really to make recommendations for you, but just to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that we're thinking about. Long Island, just a little bit of background. Long Island's a vinifera-only industry, and we have very sandy, well-drained soils. The Long Island was formed when glaciers advanced across the Northeast, so very sandy soils. We do use a lot of drip irrigation, and it's probably more than 60%. I have drip in my vineyard, so a lot of drip irrigation. And because we have these sandy soils, and because we derive our drinking water from underground aquifers, we have to be very careful how we farm on Long Island, because leaching of pesticides and nitrates has been a long-term concern in agriculture on Long Island. So we're, probably one of the most environmentally sensitive regions in the country. And we have actually very, very strict regulatory environment here, but it's necessary because of our region. So what are we doing on the floor on Long Island? Well, we're probably like a lot of other vineyards in the eastern US, and this is actually a shot of part of my vineyard. In the row middles, we start out with seeded perennial rye and fescue, maybe clover thrown in, and then it eventually progresses to having a lot of weeds infiltrate, but we do keep permanent cover in the row middle. And so I'm not going to talk about that today, but I'm going to talk about the area under the trellis. So when we talk about that area, we have to remember way back to the days before pesticides were widely available. And prior to the 60s, growers used to cultivate under vines. That's how they control the weeds. But when pesticides became widely available and herbicides were adopted by many growers in the industry because they were very cheap and very efficient, and it saved a lot of money. So as New York diversified into wine grapes in the 70s, 80s, and beyond, herbicides still remained the standard. That's what we knew how to do, how to manage our vineyards in the industry. But I'd say in the last couple decades on Long Island, we really have been evaluating all of our practices because we're an environmentally sensitive region, and also because of the philosophy. A lot of the growers out here are very environmentally oriented. A lot of our clientele, we have a lot of people from New York City coming out, and they're very concerned about farming practices. And so, I think probably more than a lot of regions, we think a lot about what we do in the vineyard. And so a lot of growers are avoiding herbicides altogether, and the goals vary, their philosophies vary. It may be to help with vigor control. Our soils are really very highly erodible. So if there's any kind of a slope at all, they might want to take that into consideration. And there's a lot of focus on soil health, enhancing organic matter, or natural organic matter can be as low as 1%. So enhancing organic matter and biodiversity and things like that's very important here. And preserving and enhancing soil carbon. And that's something that, agriculture is going to hear more and more about as we start to worry more and more about climate change. And this is a screenshot of something I just saw recently, chemical weeding banned in the vineyards of Pomerol. And there were some other regions in France that were doing this as well. And, I think this kind of movement is gaining momentum. There are a lot of concerns about not only just herbicides in general, but things like Roundup and paraquat. And I don't need to go into those specifically, but you know what I mean. And I think, I've been doing this for 35 years, which means I've been spraying vineyards for 35 years. And, I think the one thing that I feel now at this point in my career is that we really, as an industry, need to focus on trying to be good stewards of the environment, trying to do any little thing we can to help make our businesses more environmentally responsible. And, you know, it's important, and that's how I have designed my research program, and why we have a sustainable, certified sustainable program on Long Island. So again, the choice of your management system. So there's some options for sure. And it again depends on your philosophy and your feelings about herbicides and glyphosate and paraquat. But these glyphosate and paraquat, we get questions in the wineries, and guys who go into the city and sell wine say that the sommeliers and restaurant people in the city ask about that. So it's you know, it's a delicate issue in a lot of areas of the country. Your choice of management system may depend on, you know, what kind of a budget you have to do this, because some of the alternative undervine management systems can be a little more expensive, can take a little bit more time. Some of the equipment's a little bit expensive, and you need to have a tractor driver who can pay attention, because you don't want to take out vines with some of this. But you know, the bottom line for us is that I've seen, especially I'd say in the last 10 years, a huge uptick in interest in undervine alternatives. And I mean alternatives to the traditional herbicide use. So today I'm going to talk about 4 main areas: organic herbicides, cultivation, perennial ground covers, undervine mowing, and I'll just mention a few other options at the end of this. So I have played around with organic herbicides in my vineyard. These are primarily burn back materials. They have very, very short periods of control, so that if you choose to use organic herbicides, you're going to have to reapply them frequently. Coverage is really important with these materials, so you have to use a lot of water, and they are expensive. There's no getting around that. And I think, you know, that in and of itself is kind of limiting their use, because, you know, costs are a factor for many growers. I find some of them to be particularly noxious smelling. When I've applied them, I have to wear a full face respirator. I can't stand the smell. So something to be aware of if you're going to have one of your crew put that out. So Dr. Senesak, our weed scientist, actually did an experiment in my vineyard with both Axe and Home Plate. So those are 2 organically approved herbicides. He looked at primarily Home Plate with different gallonages, so 50 and 100 gallons per acre, a lot of water. And he looked at 2 different rates. And I'm not going to talk about this acidifier treatment that he included. That was kind of, let's see if this helps. But so some of the results, here's Axe versus Home Plate at 50 gallons per acre, 9% solution. And they were fairly close in their performance. I found when I was just using this for maintenance that Axe actually worked a little better than Home Plate. So for all intensive purposes, our feeling was that these were fairly close in performance. Here we are at 50 versus 100 gallons per acre. And the crabgrass control was very similar regardless of the gallonage. That's good news. You can use a lower gallonage per acre and still have good control. And here we are at 6 and 9%, so 2 different rates of Home Plate. And again, the rates were very similar. Good news, since these are expensive materials, and you can get away with using the lower percentage. Again, just some photos from my maintenance applications. Here we have a Home Plate on the right. That's 1 day after treatment, and that was done in May, and it looked pretty good. The weeds were all small. Here we are on the left in July, and you can see that the Home Plate wasn't really affecting the crabgrass and the dandelions quite as much as some of the smaller weeds. So yeah, it doesn't really do a great job on some of the hardier weeds. And pretty much, it's about a 2-week 2-week period of control. Andy seems to feel that you can get away with 3 to 3.5 weeks. You know, probably if I had vines that were stressed, I would go with a shorter interval for that. But it's not something that's going to be that you can apply once or twice during the season. You're going to need multiple applications. Home plate has kind of an oily formulation, and we found that it needs really, really good agitation. Otherwise, because I was spraying these backpacks and getting areas where it didn't look like I sprayed herbicide at all, and that's because I was not agitating well. Something to consider. And then white clover and fescue followed the same patterns as crabgrass in this study. So my slides seem to be doing their own thing too. So grower, just put these in. These were a couple of grower quotes on the use of organic herbicides. And one guy, he does not use conventional herbicides at all. He primarily cultivates. And he feels that when he is getting behind on cultivation, he can buy a little time with the organic herbicides, and that they might be useful in plantings where other techniques such as cultivation or undervine mowing are difficult. And that would be the case particularly with young vines, just due to the risk of damage. So just some thoughts from a local grower. So undervine cultivation, and these are actually a couple of units that growers on Long Island have recently purchased. I would say the majority of growers on Long Island that are not using herbicides are cultivating under the trellis. And like every technique, every strategy that you may choose, these units have advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages, of course, are that you can reduce or eliminate herbicides. Some growers are actually using them in combination with a single post-emergent. And there are a lot of different brands and types, and I am not an expert on these, but you have a lot of different options with these units. You know, the disadvantages, of course, are that they're disturbing the soil, so potentially increasing erosion and decreasing things that you want to keep around, like organic matter and soil organic carbon. And they tend to be on the expensive side. But I would say this is very, very common now on Long Island. And in fact, a couple of growers have bought this star wheel with the little, I don't even know what they call it, that little yellow thing on the bottom. I apologize, the attribution dropped off of that slide. But this star wheel is, growers like it because it's ground driven and they can go pretty fast. So they feel it does a really good job chopping up weeds and kind of throwing them off from under the trellis. The knife blade alone works. That's an old photo. It works, but sometimes it just lifts up the vines or the clods of soil and sets them back down so the weeds reroot. So it's not as efficient as some of these newer units. So that's a little bit on cultivation. What about green covers under vines? And one of the reasons that we were really interested in this on Long Island is that there's been studies all over the world, in New York and in Europe, that show that green covers under vines reduce leaching of nitrates and pesticides. And so of course, that's a really important thing for us. And you can see in this photo, if you look in the upper right, you can see how close farms are to bodies of water on Long Island. And you're looking at right here, the Peconic Bay at the bottom, and then there's a little inlet. And if you look way, way, way in the back, that's Long Island Sound. So Long Island's fairly narrow. So cover crops are part of this, one of viticulture's latest trends called regenerative agriculture. And I do not pretend to know a lot about this, but I do know that there's a huge emphasis on soil health and a huge emphasis on the use of cover crops. And, you know, I think with all these philosophies, you kind of have to find your own path and make your own choices. But I think that there's probably some things that all of us can learn when we hear about this kind of farming technique. So this is more popular on the West Coast. We're hoping to, Kane Hickey and I, Kane is the viticulturist in Penn State, hoping to put together a webinar on this sometime next spring, because I think it is worth hearing about. But cover crops are very important in this system. So we did quite a lot of work, Andy and I, with seeded covers under vines. And again, advantages and disadvantages. You can use undervine covers to control vigor if vigor is an issue in your vineyard. And you can improve soil quality by improving organic matter and carbon and reducing erosion. But there definitely are some challenges we found doing this. You absolutely have to prepare the site. The soils on Long Island are very compacted, and even under the trellis, there's a lot of compaction. Seeding, especially a large area, is not so easy. You do have to manage these cover crops. The weeds infiltrate. You may have to mow. You may have to weed whack. If these covers are tall and persistent, you can get rodents in there. And some growers that played around with these cover crops were pretty unhappy about that part. And another thing, I don't know how common this is in Ohio, but we have quite a problem with ticks on Long Island. There's a lot of species of ticks and a lot of tick-borne diseases. And so as someone who has had a tick-borne disease, I'm not looking to wade through tall cover crops when I go to a vineyard. And finally, green covers may harbor ants. And so what, except that, ants tend mealybugs, and mealybugs, at least in New York, are one of the big transmitters of leaf roll virus. And so we've always contemplated whether discouraging ants or controlling ants would actually help to control mealybugs, because leaf roll is quite a problem on Long Island and elsewhere in New York. But I'm going to talk primarily about perennial covers. There's a lot of people who have done really good work, and some with annual covers, notably Justine Van Hubel. So you can, I'm sure you can find a lot of different information from those folks. So in our trials, when we prepared the site, we either hand hoed or we cultivated with the tractor and then hand hoed out the big clumps, because there were a lot of clumps of grass and big weeds we had to get out. So important to prepare the area. And then we seeded by hand or with a lawn seeder, which, you know, again, if you're trying to do a large area, that's not really that practical. And my colleague, my Finger Lakes colleague, Hans Walter Peterson, actually rigged up a tractor mounted unit that kind of threw the seed off to the side. So here he is demonstrating that. But after you seed, it's pretty important to improve that soil seed contact. And so we actually scratched in with hose. One grower who seeded a large area actually put a little roller behind his tractor and kind of got as close as he could to the trunks and rolled the area under the trellis to improve that seed soil contact. So here's our trial, and on the left is the, wait, I have my bar here. On the left is the fescue, and on the right is the clover. So we seeded in May, and this was what it looked like in June, so we were pretty happy. You can, at least in our area, seed these in the fall as well. And here we came back the following spring, and the clover looked great. We were very proud of ourselves with that one, but the fescue looked kind of anemic, but this actually did fill in quite nicely and green up. So it just took the fescue a little bit longer to come around. The fescue established well. There were fewer escape weeds in there. It was a no-mow mix, so it stayed fairly short. We didn't have to mow it. But we found it was highly competitive for water and nitrogen. So in drought years, this really was a problem. Even with irrigation, it was kind of hard to overcome the competitive effects of this cover. And it did, in some cases, end up reducing pruning weights. The clover, on the other hand, established very quickly, had a ton of weed infiltration. It was kind of frustrating. And we noticed that when we got into dry spells in the summer that it died back. And we actually were monitoring nitrate leaching through the soil. We had these tubes called lysimeters where we could take water samples down 3 or 4 feet. And we detected when the clover died back, we actually detected a nitrogen release. And so, you know, that might be desirable in some cases, but in some cases you might not want that. But I'd say the biggest problem with the clover is that it died out and it needs reseeding. I mean, the fescue pretty much was well established and did not need reseeding. I probably, at the end of the day, these cover crops have lost favor on Long Island. And I think that's primarily because, well, for 2 reasons. One is that they still require some management. And 2 is that in dry years, they're just way too competitive. Tall covers, this photo on the right is a grower vineyard. And I personally would not walk into this vineyard because if I did, I'd be covered with ticks when I walked out. But this is red clover, and I think the grower was pretty unhappy. This is a VSP system. The clover was well up into the cluster zone, and he was having a hard time mowing it. And you know, that would definitely increase relative humidity and maybe aggravate disease control. We did find with the fescue, not in all plots, but in some plots, that voles were a problem. And you can see the trail on the right. On the left is actually a picture from my vineyard, a vine that was under snow for about 3 weeks. So this is vole damage, but not from an undervine cover crop, but it was under snow. I just wanted to show you what the vole damage looked like. So Dr. Senesac and I are actually experimenting with a new type of grass. This year, this was a company out on the West Coast that contacted us, and this is a new type of POA grass. You know, POA annua is annual bluegrass. It's a new species of POA grass that actually purportedly dies down in the summer. So this is a plot. We seeded some demo plots in my vineyard last year, and this is how it came up. And so we're hoping that that can strike kind of a happy medium between keeping most weeds at bay and maybe not providing too much competition during the growing season. To be continued. So undervine mowing, this is how I primarily control the undervine or deal with the undervine area in my vineyard. And that picture on the left is my tractor and my brand new mower taken in 2008. And it's so funny because I see that picture all over the internet now. And there I am mowing on the right. I like it for the most part. It does have some challenges. Here's a unit that growers in the industry were using for a few years. So there were probably 4 or 5 of these on Long Island. Fisher's actually an Italian company. And, you know, it worked. But I think, you know, these machines get pretty beat up, especially in vineyards where the spacing, I mean, we have vines that are 3 feet apart in the row. And so they were getting pretty beat up and growers were having trouble getting parts. These sensor arms that you see on the lower part edge of the slide, those tended to break a lot. So I don't think a lot of people are mowing anymore. So again, mowings, you know, fits in with the whole idea of reducing erosion, preserving soil organic matter. There is a problem with the weeds around the trunks of the vine, which, you know, for the most part is not an issue unless they start growing up into the vine. But you do have to drive very slowly. You can't mow weeds that are really tall and lignified because they'll just kind of lay over the weeds. They won't chop them efficiently. And at least in our experience, you can't use this system for young vines. It's just too competitive. So in my situation, I have a riverhead sandy loam soil, so very sandy soil. I wouldn't use it on vines less than say 5 or 6 years old at all. It's just too competitive. And what I do with those is I use either we hand weed those, or I use organic herbicide. And you know, vine trunk damage is an issue with these mowers. And here's some of my handiwork. You can see that, you know, even though I try and be careful, anything that's sticking out can get dinked with these mowers. And so in particular, if your vineyard is not laser planted, most of the vineyards on Long Island now, or the new vineyards going in, are laser planted, so it's not as much of a problem. But it's important to have straight trunks, otherwise you are gonna dink up the trunks. I just threw this in because sometimes I see wineries, or especially the blocks around tasting rooms, being weed whacked or being hand hoed. Not the most efficient use of your crew, and a good way to really tire them out. I saw one vineyard where the crew had weed whacked, but they had damaged the trunks so much that at veraison, the canopies turned solid red, and the grower was freaking out because they thought they had a lot of virus. But in fact, there was kind of a girdling of the trunk from the weed whackers. So maybe in some situations, but not really a long-term experience. And here's just a few more fun alternative systems. Here we have the Cornell Weed Flamer. So how'd you like to drive around with a couple of nice propane tanks on the back of your tractor? Not me, thank you. But you know, this was back in the days where they were trying to explore other systems. Here it is in action, and being used in a Concord, a high wire Concord vineyard. I love this slide, it's great. And these are provided, by the way, by my good friend Rick Dunst, who had been the farm manager of the Fredonia Vineyard Lab in Western New York. Very knowledgeable viticulturist and very good friend. I always get asked, why don't vineyards mulch? Vineyards need to mulch. It'd be perfect for your sandy soils on Long Island. I am not really a fan of mulch. I think, you know, it can be expensive. You kind of have to maintain it. Otherwise it's gonna travel all over the vineyard. Weeds do infiltrate. And I guess there's herbicide infused mulch, but you know, we'd have to have that would have to be labeled for use, number one, but also that kind of gets around, you know, if you're trying to reduce herbicide use, that's not really a viable option. When these mulches, a lot of them, when they start to break down, the microorganisms are using nitrogen as a food source. And so you really need to watch your vine nutrient levels if you're going to use a system like this. And again, rodents can be an issue. And I actually watched a talk, some mid-Atlantic grower that was using mulch, and rodents were so bad that this guy had to send his crew through the vineyard and have them clear away the mulch from around all the vine trunks because the rodents were getting to be so problematic. You know, in a dry season, this might be a really good option. And so in 2020, we had a very dry season. In 2021, it was really wet. So I would hate to have mulch like this on my vines in a wet season. Textiles, another photo from Rick Dunst. You know, expensive, I don't know, maintenance. We'd have to have drip tape under that if this were on Long Island. There are some plastics that are biodegradable, and you know, maybe this is an option for a young planting if you don't want to use herbicide. I know some nurseries in upstate New York use this, and when they're done with the nursery, then they just till it in. It's got a very short shelf life, so you can't, if it goes on sale, you can't buy a bunch of it and put it in your barn. It's going to degrade. Excuse me, and it can be pretty pricey. So maybe in some situations, but not really a solution for a mature vineyard. So sheep, how about sheep? I think this is a really interesting option and, you know, maybe appropriate in some situations. Last year during the pandemic, I watched a gazillion webinars, and I watched two in particular, Virginia Vineyards Association and a 6-hour webinar from California on sheep, using sheep. So it covered a lot of ground. But in California, they're using them mostly in the winter to control weeds. They don't have rain in the summer, so they don't have as much of a need for grazing in the summer, whereas we need them during the growing season. That's when things are growing on the vineyard floor. Excuse me. And that's a concern because we use pesticides. And, you know, we can observe the REIs and so forth, but there still might be some pesticide residues on the vineyard floor. I think, you know, that needs to be evaluated before one goes ahead with this. And I am told by someone who knows more about animal care than I do that sheep are particularly susceptible to copper. The copper is not good for them. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. So you have animal health and welfare to worry about, and it's expensive. You know, you have to, this guy in California said it took him, he estimated about $1,500 to move his flock of sheep just down the road, a mile or two, because you have to factor in the cost of the vehicles and the trailer and the shepherd and the insurance and so forth, animal care. So it's, you know, takes a little bit of effort. And this is a really, here they are in action. And they're really pretty darn cute and nice and hungry too. And thank you to Justine Vandenhoevel for providing all these slides. She's been doing some work on sheep. Here we have before and after. And, you know, pretty much if you want to have, keep another trunk, train up another trunk, you probably should protect it. They're hungry little hippos. Again, before and after. They do a pretty good job. But notice that she's been doing the work on high wire. And look, here's one guy. There's always one in every crowd, right? She's been doing it on high wire. But a lot of vineyards, a lot of vinifera vineyards are on VSP, both in the Finger Lakes and on Long Island, certainly. Our vines on Long Island are all VSP. And that's a concern because, of course, the sheep would have access to the leaves more readily. And so Justine and colleagues were thinking, well, that we could use side net or panel net. However, according to the webinars I've listened to from California and Virginia, that sheep also eat clusters. So you pretty much would have to protect the whole canopy, including the cluster zone, if you were going to use this in a VSP vineyard. And I guess there are shorter sheep, baby doll sheep. I'm not an expert in this, but you know, a lot of factors to consider. There are all kinds of other options being examined. Lynn Sosnowski, who is a weed scientist at Cornell University, is on a project with some folks on the West Coast. They're looking at electric weeders. And I'm sure over the next year or two that you'll hear more about their project. There was a grower in Long Island that used this high pressure water unit. And he said he had to drive ultra slow and it used a tremendous amount of water, you know, and of course there were concerns about, well, if it rains a lot, do we want to really be going through the vineyard multiple times with more water? So that kind of came and went. And I'd say probably the steam units have the same concerns. You know, and one of the concerns with all these is that they're probably pretty energy intensive. So, you know, maybe in the future. And that pretty much wraps it up. I'd like to thank everybody for hosting this and for inviting me to speak. That's an osprey sitting on an irrigation wheel, and happy to report that we have a really healthy, robust population of ospreys on the east end of Long Island. We were one of the areas way back when when it was, when DDT affected all these kinds of birds negatively. We were one of those areas that was impacted. So thankfully now we have quite a lot of these birds. So with that, I will say questions.